and welcome to Conscious Pathways, the podcast where we explore the intersection of education and social justice through transformative conversations. I am your host, Brittany, and before I get into our absolutely magnificent guest, I just wanted to give you a quick heads up that when this episode is coming out, this is the last week of February, and this is the last week to get your extra 15% off on the curated Black History Month 2024 list on my bookshop.org page. It has everything you could look for. It has children's books, to poetry, to cookbooks, nonfiction. So if you're in the market for some books written by Black authors and celebrating Black authors, check out the link in the show notes below. Don't forget to use the code BHM24. And that'll get you an extra 15% off up until February 29th. So don't forget to check that out. It's right down there. And speaking of celebrating and honoring amazing Black minds, I want to introduce you to our guest for today, which is Dr. Meghan Green. Dr. Green is an assistant professor of Raciolinguistic Justice in Early Childhood Teacher Education at Erikson Institute. For the past 17 years, she has served in the field of early childhood education as a researcher, an adjunct professor, a pre-kindergarten teacher to fourth grade teacher, a university field-based liaison, an anti-bias and anti-racist training facilitator. Her scholarship centers Black feminist thought and darkened feminist epistemology within early childhood settings, specifically highlighting the diverse lived experience of BIPOC early childhood educators through arts-based quantitative inquiry methods. Meghan's research interests include teachers' lived experiences on their use of cultural sustaining pedagogy, anti-racist and anti-bias teacher education in college, university settings, and anti-bias, anti-racist early childhood education. In her forthcoming edited volume, Daughters of Reimagined Early Childhood Education, Reflective Narratives in Black Women Educators in Texas During COVID-19, Meghan uses endarkened narrative inquiry to examine the lived experiences in the pedagogical development of Black women early childhood educators. I know that was a lot of information and it can feel kind of intimidating because there might be some new terminology that you might not have heard. There's definitely new terminology that I haven't heard that came up during this interview. But Dr. Green is so fantastic. She is amazing at just explaining the depth of her work and why it is so important. This conversation was just life-giving and incredible. And I learned so much, and I'm so excited to just share this with you. So let's hop into that interview. Hi, welcome to Conscious Pathways. Today I am joined by Meghan Green. Hello.
Hi, how are you doing, Brittany?
I am doing so well. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I am well.
Yay. I'm so excited to have you on and have you joining me in conversation. I know we're going to have some really just interesting topics and things that I don't even know about. So I'm really excited to just learn about these new things. I will say I was doing my research beforehand. So I was kind of just Googling you and looking at your website, looking at all the beautiful, wonderful things that you just do in the world. First of all, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. But I think it's your dissertation that starts with like Sister Outsider.
Mhm.
And I was like kind of reading through that and I was like, first of all, this is amazing. But I love it because that's like my favorite Audre Lorde book. And I was just like, is this?
And it most definitely was. And one of my committee members, that was the way that I was able to convince her
Okay.
to join the work. She was in the English department. She was like, oh
Really?
my gosh, an education dissertation that is referencing Audre Lorde. Yes, I want to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I love that. I love that. That's how you reel them in. I love this.
You know?
I have it somewhere on my book list, my bookshelf behind me, and it is such a beautiful work. And I haven't reread it in a couple of years now, so I feel like I'm feeling inspired to go back and reread it because I remember feeling so empowered after I read that book. I was like, dang, I want to do things with life now.
Like I too could go out and like disrupt this myth.
Exactly. Like that could be me. So loved that. And one question I always want to ask first is, so why early childhood education? What got you interested in education in general? What was the inspiration? Who inspired you?
So the funny story is always that I'm a third generation educator. Okay? My grandmother was an educator, my mom was an educator. But growing up, I saw how difficult it was for educators. So I wanted to steer away from
Mm.
that. So I actually majored in anthropology in undergrad,
Hmm.
and I wanted to be an anthropologist. I was really inspired by Zora Neale Hurston. I ended up going to Howard because of Zora Neale Hurston and the connections to anthropology, and to, of course, her literary works. But then my junior year at Howard University, I was volunteering in Northeast DC, and it was working with first and second graders, and I fell in love. And so instead of just completely saying, I'll stay here, right, in DC another like 2 years to switch this major, I decided to do an alternative certification program and then kind of make the switch into early childhood education. And it was really just
Mm.
from being exposed to just the brilliance of young children, right? There's just this love
Yes.
and this curiosity that I was like, I love anthropology. I love the theoretical work that is there. I love studying culture, but there's something here that I
Mm.
feel is more important to be a part of. So,
Yes. Yes. And I love that. There is such a beauty and power. And I feel like that happens with a lot of people who kind of fall into education
right.
is that you get to experience the beauty and power of working with young children. And obviously it's more than just hanging out with kids and playing with kids all day. It's just a thought process that they have.
Hmm.
I was, working with the school the other day, and this little girl was like showing me around the whole playground, and everything was so marvelous to her. Like as she was just showing like every little tiny rock that was in the dirt, every little tiny thing. She was like, "Look, do you see it?" And I'm like, "I do see it."
Right.
But it's just fascinating. The way that they see the world is just with such awe and wonder, and the way that they investigate the world and just learning how they grow and learning how their brains work. It is a beautiful, glorious thing to get to be a part of, and I love it.
Yeah. So that was the kicker for me, right? Like you've been running away from education for years, and then because young
Mm,
children are very persuasive, and they bring you in
they are.
and wanting to be a part of, as you said, how they see the world, how they engage.
Yes, yes. I love that. That is so exciting. And it's really exciting that you're a third generation teacher. And that is also such a beautiful thing, just being able to see that, seeing the beauty that your grandmother and your mother went through, but also seeing, what the challenges and the struggles are like kind of firsthand. And I'm assuming that that was also a part of, your journey and a part of that research and what you continue to advocate for as well.
Definitely, I think it was that part
Mm,
of how educators bring themselves into classrooms, right? That was the part that
mm,
inspired me to kind of focus in on the topic that I did, and really
mm,
probably sustains the work that I do now. um, just kind of helping
mm.
make those connections between how we bring ourselves fully into spaces.
Yes. Yes, that is so important. I love that you mentioned like bringing ourselves fully into education, and from what I've seen and the things that you've written, and of course the background of your dissertation, right? That is a really big part of that, especially when you're thinking about people of color, and especially Black women who are predominantly within education, especially early childhood education. Statistically, there's a lot of brown people in this field, and how can we show up as our full selves in a system that is not designed for us to show up with our full selves is something that is definitely worth the research, and it's worth diving more into, because it's a fascinating experience as a person who's actively experiencing it. Yes, yes. And so what a couple of things that I've noticed within your writings and things that you've talked about, and it's something that as I mentioned before, it's not something I'm super familiar with, and it's something that, it's a term that's really new to me, and I'm sure it's also fairly new to my audience, and that's, endarkened narrative inquiry and endarkened feminist narrative. So could you kind of explain that a little bit more to me and the audience, and how does that influence your work?
Right. So I think my experiences with Endarkened Feminist Narrative and Endarkened Narrative Inquiry really kind of stem from what we just stated, right? This idea of how do we bring ourselves fully into roles
Mm,
of education, right? In spaces that are sometimes what refers to as a spirit murdering, right? They're harmful spaces.
mm,
So when I was thinking about the methods I wanted to use, the methodology I wanted to use for this research, knowing that storytelling was a big part of how I grew up. I'm from South Louisiana, from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and so storytelling and this rich oral history has always been a part of my life. But when looking at how to incorporate that from a research standpoint, right? What I found was that fields was still it was very much so dominated by these very white narratives, these very white ways of,
Mm,
and these very linear ways of telling stories. And that's not the tradition that I come from, right? A story may
mm,
start here, it may end in a different place, but it ends up back over here in this circular pattern. And the storytelling was very fluid. And so I was searching
mm,
for um, information about narrative inquiry that was more culturally situated. And so I happened upon the
mm,
work of um, Keandra McClish Boyd and Dr. Bakali Bhattacharya. And so that is, there are the theorists with endarkened feminist narrative. And then the universe saw fit to put me in close connection with a previous colleague from Erikson Institute, Dr. Turner, who had developed endarkened um, feminist narrative for her dissertation.
mm,
And so I think we were all searching for these ways of how do you honor Black women's ways of being, knowing
mm,
Black women educators, ways of storytelling that weren't found, right, in the literature that we were trying to uh, support, that we were trying to place our research in. So those two in
mm,
particular really helped to push me. I think not just as a researcher, but just as a Black woman existing in the world, right? That
mm,
I know that there are particular ways of being and the ways in which I engage with the world that weren't necessarily reflected in some of the things that other folks thought were seminal. But
mm.
those two methodologies in particular are very helpful for me.
Yes, yes. And as you mentioned, that is so important and such a great thing to start diving into and looking into because, when I'm going through training and I'm going through, college and all of that, a lot of the theorists that we look at are, you know, old dead white guys.
Hmm. Right?
And it wasn't, yeah, and it wasn't until I specifically went to a school that was, grounded in social justice that I started to experience other ways of thought and I started to experience other ways of teaching. And, I went to Pacific Oaks. And so with it, like, that's part of like its, philosophy of the way the school exists. And so we all kind of sit in a circle when we're in class. And I experienced firsthand what that feels like to be able to show up as my authentic self as a student.
Right.
And I experienced what that looks like as, from an educator, from my professors showing up as their true and authentic selves, and I got to experience the transformative power of that in the classroom. And so being able to see that and experience that and feel it, then it shifted the way that I showed up in my own work as an educator. And it showed up and how I show up in the classroom and how I show up for families in my program, because I know that when I can show up as my full and authentic self, I know that that's going to impact my students, right? The young students who are coming into my classroom, they can now feel safe to be their full and authentic selves, and the families can be their full and authentic selves, and it just kind of causes this chain reaction
Right. Right.
rather than trying to fit into this peg that just it's not going to fit because it's not meant to fit.
Hmm. Exactly.
Yes, yes. So yes, I'm very, I love this topic and I love this idea. Like I said, it's very new to me, but I'm so excited to just dive more into it because it's fascinating. And how have you seen, these concepts kind of, how have you seen them in the real life, and how have you seen them kind of make that impact outside of, the research realm and into the practice realm?
Right. Right. So I think making the transition for me. So when I was an early childhood educator for oh 15, 16 years, right? And so when I graduated with my doctorate and made the transition into higher ed, there was a switch. In, well, now I'm at the point of pre-service, early childhood educators, in-service teachers. How do I still kind of bring some of that same energy around honoring and centering, right, culturally situated ways of being and knowing um, into my practice of working with students. Um, and so, how it's kind of come up for me is through, I think, more so the assignments and how I engage with my students. So, you mentioned
Mm,
your experiences at Pacific Oaks and how that impacted, when you're now working with young children or working with families. I think I wanted to keep that front and center. So every
mm,
class period, right, we start with a how's your heart, right?
mm,
Because there was a big thing coming up in Endarkened Feminist Narrative and Endarkened Narrative Inquiry that the center of Black women's lived experiences is this idea of there is a spiritual aspect or a sacred aspect that goes kind of beyond some of the very limited ways that people have thought about spirituality, right? That when we're
mm,
talking about Black women's connection to the more than human aspects of what
mm.
around us. And so when I make the connections with my students of, well, how's your heart? Right? Just not necessarily in a how are things going with this course? Yes, I want to know how things are going with this course, but how are you? Right? How are you?
Mhm.
Well, how are things going that just that folks don't necessarily ask you about, right?
Yes.
Because we know what the research tells us about educators, specifically early childhood being, um,
Mm,
how we were put in the position of being seen as essential workers, right, without necessarily the respect of what it means to be essential. And how do we
mm,
become not just essential to as cogs in the machine, right, but how do we become essential
yeah,
to ourselves, right? And how do we honor
mm,
those parts of ourselves that we consider to be essential? So I think all of those elements of uh, in dark really found their way into how I engage and interact with people. I think that was the biggest shift.
mm. Yes, yes. And yeah, exactly. Like, how are we interacting? And how I love that idea of like genuinely asking, like, how is your heart, and adding that spirituality component of it. Because regardless of what your relationship with spirituality is and your relationship with religion is, right? Like, we can all understand that there's a connection piece to that, and that's kind of like at the heart of it, really what we're saying. And really checking in, genuinely checking in with people. How is your heart? How is it doing? What are the challenges? What is bringing you joy? And that really does set the pace when I'm doing trainings with educators. That's something I try to do. So there's people do icebreaker questions, which is, it's nice,
Right.
but really really getting a little bit deeper. Right, because what we're really trying to do is we're trying to build a community for however long you have either this group of adults with, or ever how long you have this group of children with, right, is making these authentic and vulnerable connections with people, and part of that is really connecting. um, and I think sometimes that gets lost in when we're doing professional development, or we're doing trainings, or we're doing you know these other things. It kind of gets lost in, like, you have all these other things that you're focusing on, especially in education. You're like, okay, I have my program outcomes, I have DRDPs, or I have all these different things that I'm focusing on. And yes, it's important that we are gathering data. Yes, it's important that we're making data driven decisions. Yes, it's important that we have guidelines and standards that we're following.
Yeah.
Yes to those things. But also at the same time, we're connecting and working with people who have so many other things going on in their lives, and have choosing to spend this one time with us. We should be connecting with them, and we should be fostering these really deep and important connections with them, because that's kind of how we tap into that true good feel good learning.
Right. Definitely.
Yes. And so it seems like a big part of these kind of, thought processes and methodologies is narrative, and storytelling. And so we're talking about kind of anti-racist and anti-bias work. How does storytelling and narrative work kind of fit into, our work and advocacy into creating more inclusive environments through anti-bias and anti-racist work?
Right. So I think narratives and stories were it's a first touch point, right? So we just spoke about
Mm,
connection and how do we build
mm,
spaces where people feel comfortable, right? in being vulnerable and creating these connections. So I tell people all the time, we can say that we want to create a sense of belonging, right? We can say that one of
Mm-hmm.
our goals as anti-bias educators or anti-racist educators is to create inclusive spaces where people feel a sense of belonging. But we don't create a sense of belonging by simply like wishing that it was so, right?
Yeah.
If only, if it were that easy. So
If only.
right? If only. But we get to that space of having a sense of belonging, right, through our actions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, narrative and the power of stories and people having the space to kind of reflect on their own individual narratives. So there's something that I do there's a assignment that kind of goes across the semester where every week students are kind of reflecting on certain intersections of their identity, and some of that work is done
Mm-hmm.
individually, right, which is important for like that
Yeah.
individual critical self-reflection, but also that's also part of the endarkened piece of disrupting this binary between the individual and the collective,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sometimes we need to do some of that self-reflection communally, right? And I think that that's a huge part of what we do as anti-bias and anti-racist early childhood educators is that we're always accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not asking yourself how you are accountable to your community, right, then you're probably not fully doing the work that you think that you're doing. And I think stories
Mm-hmm.
are a way to help us to push that boundary of how do we stay accountable to ourselves and also accountable to those around us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, yes. And in addition to that, I feel like our brains work in a very kind of story centered way, whether, from how our brains have developed. And I'm sure, like, you kind of studying anthropology, you kind of know these things too, but like our brains love stories. Um, I like to put that as the reason why I struggled with math because it's not a very story based thing.
Right.
So I prefer stories. Thank you, math. But yeah, our brains are just geared towards stories. They want to hear stories, and we learn really well through kind of these narrative ways. And, especially when we look back on how we teach young children, a lot of that is through narrative, and a lot of that is through either, by reading books or doing, puppets or a dramatic play. That's a lot of their learning is coming through either acting out things in life or seeing things acted out in life. They're always observing and they're always listening, even if we don't think that they are.
All the time. All the time.
all the time. It's like, okay, I tell you to do something a million times, but you're listening to that. Okay, cool. Um, but yes, narrative and storytelling is such an important thing, and it also is really engaging. It is something that draws people in, and like you hear a really good story, and like you start leaning in, and you're like, I want to know more about this. I want to see where the story is going, and I'm curious. Um, and so, especially when we're thinking about community and we're thinking about how are we being accountable to our community and those around us, I do agree. I think storytelling and using narratives is such a powerful way to do that. It brings the real life into the practice. It's the praxis of it all, really. When you're bringing in, that theory and practice, it becomes the praxis of it, and it's a beautiful thing to see.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yes, yes. Um, and so, we're talking about narrative and we're talking about, teachers. And of course, the main theory is like really bringing in our true and authentic selves and bringing in our real life experiences, So we're talking about culturally sustaining pedagogy. How do you think that teachers can bring their real life lived experiences into the classroom in an early childhood setting?
So one of the things that, so within, from my dissertation research, but a part of that was that I was working with educators that I previously taught with. And so these were women
Mm,
that I already had some connections to, right? And I was able to observe just how in their classrooms they were able to embody, they didn't necessarily know that someone else would
mm,
call it culturally sustainable pedagogy, right? But it's exactly what they were doing, right? So what they were doing was kind of matching what we see in the literature. And what they were doing was
mm,
reciprocating authenticity. And then, so I think you mentioned it earlier, this idea of if I don't show up as um, authentically as I can, right? So they didn't hide themselves.
mm,
I had one of my coworkers was also from South Louisiana. And so she was maybe from an hour away from where I was from. And so whenever Mardi Gras would come around, right, she'd bring out every bit of everything that kind of stigma. She was from South Louisiana, right? And that was something that she felt comfortable sharing with her students. Many of us had, whether it was tattoos or piercings, and coming into an early childhood space, there's still some level of respectability that folks have, and they're like, oh my God, how are kids going to react to that? They're like, kids are going to react to
Yeah.
it like, you know, so and so in my family has that exact same thing, or I really like that. That's
Yeah.
really pretty, because it's the realness, right? As you said, it's the realness of
Mm.
how we bring ourselves into the space. So I think
Yes.
as I'm talking to um, my students now in the higher education and we're going over these concepts of, well, what does it mean to bring culture, to make a space culturally sustainable? What we focus in on is this idea of how are you showing up, right? How are you showing up in the space? Um, and then when you show up in that space, how are you engaging with how you show up, your lived experience is going to really impact the views that you have of children and
Mm.
seeing children as brilliant. Are you seeing them as just absolutely amazing beings, right? What is the lens that you're bringing? One of my friends from the study, she had this saying that was so amazing that I actually pulled it out and used it as a title for something else. She's like, it's not what you have on your walls, it's how you're delivering the messages to these kids that makes the difference.
Mm.
And that to me was that was it. Because I think when people saw buzzwords like culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustainable,
Mm.
thought, okay, I just need to get that I can stop at representation, right? So if I get a whole bunch of posters or
Mhm.
books that uh, really represent Black and Brown folks, I can stop there, and I never really have to interrogate
Mm.
who I am and maybe how I'm using these materials because you could have
Mm.
fabulous children's book and still give a very problematic read aloud, right? In how you're
Yes.
engaging with young just because the book is
Yes.
great doesn't mean your delivery or implementation of that is going to be
Mhm.
great if you aren't interrogating some of those things that you might have to unlearn, right?
Yes.
And that was at the heart, I think, of my ideas around, well, what does it really mean for us to create culturally sustaining spaces? That, yes, we need to shift the physical materials that we have in spaces, right? But if teachers aren't going to
Mhm.
do some of that self work and the ongoing work, then none of that's going
Mhm. That is so incredibly beautiful.
to.
Because it is so true. And, I remember being in the classroom years ago and, I didn't even know what culturally, responsive and culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy was, but it was a thing that I was doing. It was a thing that I was bringing into the classroom because it just kind of made sense for me, right? And I agree. Sometimes I do walk into other classrooms and, I see all the boxes are checked, right? I'm seeing, okay, there's diversity on the walls and I'm seeing there's diversity in the books, but then I'm looking around and I'm like, okay, this classroom itself is not very diverse.
Right,
Our teaching staff is not very diverse, and I'm looking around and, there's language out there and, it's like, okay, there's still work that needs to be done
right, right.
to get us there, right? We were looking great, but I don't know if we're practicing great yet. And it takes time and it's hard. And no one said it's going to be easy work. That it's, you can't just, wave a magic wand and you are now, anti-biased, anti-racist educators. It is hard, consistent, everyday work that gets us to getting closer to that point where we're having more inclusion. We're having, classrooms that feel that can be authentic and can, every child can show up as their true and authentic selves. Um, and that's that's what we're striving for. That's where we're going. We're gonna get there.
Right? It is definitely it's an ongoing
Yeah.
process, and I think that that's also the
Mm-hmm.
other thing. We have hit such a place where people want something. They're like, "Well, what can we do right now?" So I had a period where I was doing more facilitation of trainings, and I think one thing that I noticed when administrators would reach out or districts would reach out, they kind of want this box curriculum, right? This easy fix. And so wanting you to come in, right, do a 1 day professional development with teachers,
Mm-hmm.
and then the next day, right, wanting to do classroom observations to kind of see if change had happened. And so sometimes
Mm-hmm.
there's a discomfort with being able to acknowledge that even when we start to make the changes that we need to make, right, we're
Yeah.
not always going to get it right. And we have to acknowledge that we're not always
Mm-hmm.
going to get it right. Because when we don't get it right, that is kind of where we're going to be tested. So what do we do now, right? How do we respond when I don't do something right and I have to be called out on it, right? Maybe by a peer, colleague, um, or
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in the position, and I think this is something that I've heard uh, teachers also kind of struggle with, and how do they hold others around them accountable? So if I see a peer that maybe is engaging in something, well, that's kind of harmful. How do I call that out, right, in a way that
Mm-hmm.
still kind of embodies the spirit of restorative justice, so that people aren't disposable and I'm not
Yes.
throwing people away, but I've still got to acknowledge, right, the impact of
Mm-hmm.
this harm, and that this practice is not what we want to do, and that we're trying to do some things.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully, hoping that people are, able to build communities where that can be more
Yes.
than the norm. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how do we hold each other accountable in ways where we're not disposing of each other?
Yes, yes. And I think that's where, restorative justice really comes hand in hand with a lot of these practices because that is that return to community, that return to, accountability. I think sometimes when people think of alternative ways of justice, people think about, um, like, oh, people aren't going to be held accountable or people
Right.
are just going to get away with everything. Like everyone's just going to be able to hurt people and, there's not going to be any repercussions for people's actions. And that's not quite the case. Like returning to community doesn't mean that that people aren't being held accountable, that harm's not being acknowledged, right? It's that when we have a very punitive practice of you do harm, then you basically get harmed because of the harm, then it just kind of perpetuates a cycle that kind of is never ending, where harm is just kind of continued, continued, continued. Whereas, we go restorative justice route and we're looking at, okay, what as a community do we want to have? What values do we have? What's important to us? And what happens when people are outside of that community values, and how do we, like you're saying, call people in so we're not just like throwing someone away because they've caused harm. We're people, right? We're not perfect, we're not machines. We're gonna mess up, we're gonna say something, we're gonna do something. And a part of the beauty of being a human is that we can learn, is that we can change, is that we have the capacity to do that as long as we're willing and we want to. And being part of community is something most people are willing and want to be a part of, right? So looking at ways of how can we still hold people accountable for our actions, and how can we call someone in and say, hey, harm was done, let's look at it, let's acknowledge it, let's see how this is impacting our community, how this is impacting our our overall kind of safety, how's everyone feeling in this moment. And bringing that in and calling each other in is so important, right? And I think that is sometimes a lot of the times why people don't want to engage in this kind of work of anti-racism and anti-bias work, is because there's that fear of like, well, if I do it wrong, then, I'm going to get canceled. Or if I do it
Right.
wrong, I'm going to get fired. And that really shouldn't be the case. And that's not really why it exists.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't exist to point a finger and shame people for not knowing it. It seeks to increase the knowing of, hey, there's things that are happening, there's harm that's happening, let's acknowledge it, let's look at it, because the more we don't look at it, the more it hurts, right? Someone is hurting and we're not acknowledging that hurt. We're just kind of glazing right over it, and that doesn't feel good, that doesn't feel safe, and that doesn't help our community in any way, right? And so looking at, how can we as a community have those values, hold people accountable, and also continue to help and support people, because that's what community does.
Right. Right.
Yes. And so kind of speaking on that, I know like I said, it's not easy to do this kind of work, and it does take a lot of introspection, and it takes a lot of, talking with people and working with people and building community. And so it's not just on the teacher's hands to do this. It is on, our educational leadership, our administration. It's on, the community as at whole, as a large. Um, so what would you say for, community, or for, educational leaders and admin who want, to build a community and build an educational community that is supportive of this type of work? What can they do to kind of build that, and what can they do to support teachers as they're growing in this work as well?
Right. So it was one of the themes that came up while talking to Black women educators in particular. This idea of, well, how are you able to sustain this work, right? So even when folks felt compelled as individuals to engage in anti-bias and anti-racist work with young children, it really what pushed them, well, what either hindered them, right, or helped them to thrive were their educational leaders. And so, speaking from the space that we were in, the practices that we were a part of that we know kind of helped us to thrive in our practice included bringing everyone together, right? So, creating those spaces for how do we build community? Kind of goes back to what we were saying about this sense of belonging. So I didn't have an administrator, or well, administrators, because I would think I say all of them were part of that community for us. It wasn't just one administrator, but we didn't just come together, right, for faculty meetings or for staff meetings. We did, right, when we needed to do our professional things, we did. We came together when we needed to.
Yeah.
But also, they made space and time for us to come together outside of our professional time, right? What does it look like? We talk about bringing yourself in. So I'm a mother of two boys. I think all of my administrators were also parents. But even for the folks who are not, what does it look like to be able to bring my family members, right, to our school potluck or our school gathering, right? Our little family engagement for us didn't just necessarily mean the caregivers and the parents of the students who were part of the school. Family engagement also meant the families of our educators and our staff members. So when we had these family events, everyone came, right? And so folks who were, even if you weren't necessarily, even if you didn't have a child that was associated with our school, we were so inundated in the community that folks just within the community were like, oh, something's going on over there. Let's go hang out over there, right? And so I think you build community, educational leaders can help to create this sense of community to where when we say, because we hear it all the time, people are like, oh, this was a family. And people give the side eye, they're like, I don't know, I'm not part of it. I don't know if I'm part of that family. But that's a genuine, that's a genuine reaction. If you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have, just because you say that we're a family, right, doesn't mean that I feel a part of that. And then it
Yes.
goes back to this idea of, well, because we are family, that means that sometimes we may not necessarily um, see eye to eye, right? And so, what structures do we have in place for when we don't see eye to eye? They used to ask us the question, and the first week they asked it, everyone was like, I don't have an answer to that. They're like, who's your work best friend? And we were all like, my best friend isn't here. My best friend is, I don't have a work best friend. What does that even mean? But what they were trying to get us to, and probably took a couple years, right? That first year, it didn't necessarily land as they thought it would. But over a couple years, we got to the place where we asked the question, who's your work best friend? How we conceptualized that was in this frame of when everything around you seems to be falling apart, right? Or on the flip side of that, when you are bursting with joy and you can't wait to share it with someone, who in this building, right, is that, or who are those people? And they said that if we have not created a space where everybody here has at least one person who fits that, then we're not doing what we need to do as leaders. And so I think that was important, that it wasn't just their words that said we want to make this a space where people belong, We want to make this feel, like it's a family. Um,
Yeah.
they put the structures in place for that to happen. And I don't know that I've ever, well, I don't want to give the implication that that can't happen again. I feel like, but I think people have to be very intentional, right? You have to be very
Yes.
intentional about how you're going to invest your energy, and how you are going to pour into the educators that are in that space. And how are you all going to work together to achieve that?
Mm-hmm.
Because the buy-in for it, we all had to, that it had to be a collective, buy-in. Because folks who
Yes.
didn't really stay in the space.
Yes. And I love that you've connected that with the intentionality
Mhm.
because that is so important. I got a little activated when you said family because I was like, oh geez, I've been in nonprofits. I've worked in nonprofits. It's like we're a family here, so like we can all work overtime. And it's like that's not what that means.
That part, it does not mean we're going to take advantage or exploit our family, right? I would like for you not to
Yes.
exploit me as my family member.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but we have to,
Yes.
and so that was part of it too, having a shared
Mm-hmm.
understanding, having some very real, right, tough conversations on, okay, when you say family, what do you mean? Because here's been my
Yes.
experience, right, of this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean when you say it? And then how can we
Yes.
get to a place where we maybe have the shared vision of what we want it to be, right? Here's where we are now. Here's where we
Yes.
aspire to be. Now, what do we have to do to kind of get there?
Yes. Yes. And those are so like all of that is just so important for building up that community and building up a really cohesive team that does genuinely care about each other and does genuinely care about each other's well-being. I've worked in places where that was the case, where we had a really strong solid team and it did feel very like kind of family-esque, but the positive connotations of
Right.
family, of course. And just, I know that I could count on people, or if I was struggling with something, like, hey, I'm overwhelmed with all these, things I got to do in the classroom. Can someone step in for me really fast? And without a doubt, someone would be there in seconds, like, I got you. And the way that that fills you up, because teaching, it's a hard profession. There's a lot that goes into it. It takes a lot out of you. It fills you up in a lot of really beautiful ways, but it also takes a lot. And you have to do a lot. There's a lot of empathy and compassion. You can get compassion fatigue, and it's a lot. It's a lot that goes into it, and it's understandable that it's a very high field where people do get burned out quite often. Um, but having a team around you, that is one of those factors that can help kind of mitigate or help prevent some of that burnout. Is if you have a really cohesive team and you know that you are supported, and you know that your admin is supporting you, you know that your co-teachers and your coworkers are supporting you, and that can kind of help mitigate some of those really really tough challenges that can come with the education field. And a lot of that is intentionality and really intentionally building that. It doesn't always just happen on its own. There's usually has to be some intentionality around it, and some building and some work that goes into really creating it. And I've also, like I said, worked in those environments where people are like, we're a family here, and it just was traumatizing
Yep.
experience.
It can be
just
very toxic,
it could be very toxic. So I'm like, okay, no, I think we need to redefine what you think family means.
Huh?
Um, but it is important. It's important that that community is there, and that is kind of that role of that administrator and that leader in that role is to help to build that and help to kind of forage people and help people build those their best selves within their work. I think sometimes we forget that when we get into management or we get into a leadership role, we start thinking that it's this other thing, or it's like, okay, well, I have to make everyone do this and I have to do that, where it's like, not quite. Like, your role as that manager is to uplift the people around you. Your role is to like kind of provide them the support so that they can really be their best selves, so they can show up as their best selves, and that they can grow in whatever way growth looks like to them. So some people want to, like, I want to become a manager, I want to become the director, I want to keep, some people want to climb that ladder, and that is their true desires. And some people are very okay with where they are, and they just kind of want to be the best teacher that they can be. And both of those things are very okay, but that comes with knowing your team and knowing the community that you're within, and kind of helping and supporting everyone to get to the wherever it is they're trying to go, because that's what community does.
Right. Right.
um, I have another question for you. So, in terms of intersectionality,
Mhm.
so as part of my podcast, I talk about it's an intersection of social justice and education, and I'm not sure if we've really talked about intersectionality on the podcast, like as it's it's a pretty big topic, um, and so when we're talking about intersectionality, it is looking at how two things can be true at the same time, right? So my experience as a Black person and my experience as a woman, and that intersection of being a Black woman, and how that kind of influences the work that I do. And it also influences how I am treated in society, and it is how how I express in the society. And so we talk about intersectionality, and how that shows up in our anti-bias and our anti-racist work in early childhood education. How can we kind of influence educators to embrace that intersectionality, and especially educators and leadership as well?
So one of my colleagues, who's absolutely brilliant, Dr. Lily Padilla, reminds me all the time, right, that when we talk about intersectionality, that we aren't just necessarily running down like this list of identity markers. And I was, that's
Mm-hmm.
okay, that's important for us to lift up, right? Especially when we ask educators to consider this like intersectional lens, and we start by maybe doing one of our favorite anti-bias activities, which is like some form of identity weaving, right? We love it. We love to do some form of
Yes.
identity mapping. Um, but
Yes.
it's also important to think about, as you said, what are the power dynamics, right? That kind of
Mm-hmm.
overlap when we're discussing all of these intersections of identity. I think it
Mm-hmm.
comes up for us as we think about, so traditionally, K-12 spaces have been, or teacher education spaces have been overwhelmingly white women. I am in an institution now where most of our students are Black and Latinx women, right? And so it's been a different experience as someone who's now on the higher ed in as a Black queer woman working with primarily Black and Latinx women, working also with a larger population of like LGBTQ folks than I have ever worked with in a higher ed space before. And so thinking about how all of these we kind of operate with one another, the question has come up before, well, what does it look like when, let's say, Black women start having conversations about language bias and linguistic racism, right, in early childhood classrooms? Like, that's come up for us, right? It's come up because folks are maybe have never been in a space where they've had to consider all of these things at one time, right? Where they've had conversations
Yeah.
about, because sometimes we think, well, when we have these conversations about critical self reflection, that I'm just focusing this conversation on like the white women in the room who need to interrogate maybe around race and gender privilege and whatnot, or heteronormative privilege. But in our case, we're talking to folks who are like, well, I'm from the south side of Chicago, so I've only ever spoken English. But then we get in a conversation about dialects, right, and being bi-dialectal, and how does your view as an early childhood educator impact whether you think a standard form of a dominant language, right, should be like forced upon
Yeah.
young children? That impacts you, right? This idea
Yeah.
of power dynamics. And so I think that is how intersectionality has really shown up for how I engage with early childhood education. And it's been the push of having folks think about systemic oppression, right, in multiple lenses, um, and
Yeah.
how that impacts how they're then going to engage with children and with families. And how some of that internalized, right? Those internalized messages. We talked a lot about narrative storytelling. So the internalized stories that we have, stories that they've been passed down for generations, right? And how that shows up now that we are the educators.
I love mentioning, those power dynamics and how important they are when we are considering intersectionality, right? Because it's not just like I have these identities, cool. That's great. Our
Right.
identities are really important to us, and they're important for our individuality, and they're important for our, sense of belonging and community, right? But there's also that idea of these dynamics and how, power, privilege, and oppression, how they also interact with how our identities are interacting out there in the greater society, and we all have identities that are, part of what's considered the dominant and what's, considered the non-dominant one. We all have those kind of intersections. And so, even as a Black woman, which is typically seen as kind of like the lower kind of social rung, I also have identities that also put me more into the kind of dominant sphere as well. So it's looking at how then does that privilege show up for me, and what kind of unearned privileges do I have because of those identities, and how is that showing up in my classroom, and how is that showing up, for the students who are, again, looking at me and looking to me as, this, being in the classroom that is, like, obviously I know more than the children. So when I say things, they're like, wow, she's amazing. So they're looking to me to understand how the world is working. And if I'm not working on those internalized things that, parts of my identity that either I don't know much about, or parts of my identity that I do have unearned privileges from, if I'm not looking at those and I'm not acknowledging how that shows up in my everyday life, there could be unintentional harm that is perpetuating that. Again, it's unintentional. I'm not trying to perpetuate harm, right? I don't think most people are trying to do that, but it does happen when we're not being intentional, and when we're not looking at these things and being aware of how that impacts others. Um, so yes, love it.
Yes.
I do have one final question for you, and that is, how do you reimagine education?
Oh, it's a big one. Okay, we said big one for that. So I think when I think about reimagining education, um, I really think about my own process of learning and unlearning, right? I think about the teacher that I was when I did make the decision way back in 2004, 2005. When I first fell in love with children and decided that, okay, I want to do this, I want to do this as a profession. Um, and I think about some of the ideas that I had at that time, um, and though well intentioned, right? A lot of those ideas were maybe even then still more focused on changing children or changing
Mm-hmm.
families or communities in some way. And then now fast forward 20 years later, right? Thinking about, I want to go to the children now and ask them how they want to imagine the world, right? I want to work alongside children to kind of make this new world. So I've been, over the last year, definitely on like my Octavia Butler Afrofuturism, uh, you know, space. And it's like, we're going to do all these earthseed things. you know, we're going to go out, we're going to build communities, and we're going to change the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really been this process of thinking alongside children, but having an intergenerational, right? Intergenerational freedom dreaming, I think, has been one of the things that has come up for me when reimagining education. So, how can we ask children to think of the worlds that they want to thrive in? How can I talk to my elders who have been through so much, right? Who've witnessed so much,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe have them reflect on the things that they've gone through, and maybe take those pieces that they've gone through. They're like, I want to see more of this. I want this to continue. Keep that. of reflecting over past experiences, but also there's so much more, right, that I want to experience. So this sense of intergenerational freedom dreaming, having the space where we can do that, right? I think about
Yeah.
educators being able to come into spaces where they don't feel like they have to check parts of themselves at the door, right? Um, Again, the other day, I was like, there's certain parts of me that I felt were very well represented, maybe within or through my educational journey, and then parts that were not, right? And I just never necessarily expected them to be reflected there because they never had been. And I would love for that to be a shift where educators don't feel that they have to check parts of themselves at the door, and they can go into those spaces whole. And so if we create spaces where people are coming in whole, our adults are whole, right? Our elders. So I think that creates this wholeness of a community.
Yes, yes, yes. I love this. I love the mention of the intergenerational impact of that. And again, that goes back to building community and everyone being a part of that community, right? Because, homogenous, you think of a homogenous community and it's like, well,
Yeah,
there you are, but there's so much beauty in having a community that is filled with, people of different ages, of different backgrounds, of different cultures, right? It brings so many different perspectives in it. And, bringing our elders into the conversation is so important. They've seen so much, they've been through so much, they've experienced so much, and they have so much, to pass on and so much to provide that, why would we exclude them from that? So yes, intergenerations, and I love that. Thank you so much for joining me, Meghan. Where can my audience find you if they're looking to connect, if they're looking for anything that you're coming out with, anything to be on the lookout for?
yeah. So there are probably two spaces that I operate in most. One is my website. So it's drmegangoen.com. Don't get confused by that name thing. But also on X, formerly known as Twitter. So at Dr. Megan Green. That's my handle.
Well, thank you so much, Meghan. I really appreciate you joining me. I learned so much. I'm sure my audience learned a lot. And I just want to thank you so much for just taking the time out of your day to speak with me. It's an absolute pleasure getting to meet you.
It was so nice meeting you.
Thank you for tuning in to Conscious Pathways. Don't forget to like, share, and follow Conscious Pathways wherever you get your podcasts. Also, don't forget to share or leave a rating or review. It really does help the podcast to grow and reach more listeners just like you. Don't forget, check out the link in the show notes for bookshop.org, where you can get an additional 15% off of the curated Black History Month list, and then add the code BHM24 to check out to get your additional 15% off. If you love supporting this podcast, if you love supporting local independent bookshops, and you love supporting Black authors, then check out that link in the show notes. And until then, don't forget to navigate your conscious journey with courage and kindness. And I'll see you then for more transformative conversations in education.